questions, what words come to mind when you hear agriculture subsidies or support policies? So you see things like corn, that's very American, money, politics, government, meat, perverse, huge, necessary, big ag, fuel subsidies, whole range of things. I think what this shows is that people have a lot of different ideas when it comes time to subsidies. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm really pleased that Columbia's Climate School, EAT, and the Food Systems Economic Commission have come together to co-host this event in the midst of a very busy week here in New York. President Biden is in town right now, ready to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. My name is Jessica Fanzo. I'm a professor of climate and food at Columbia's Climate School, and I'm the director for the Food for Humanity initiative. It's a real pleasure to see all of you, particularly students. It's nice to have you all in the room. Maybe just a little bit about the three hosts. The Columbia Climate School is the first climate school in the country, and it was established in 2020 to educate future climate leaders, support groundbreaking research, and foster essential climate solutions for the community to the planetary scale. And we're really pleased to be hosting a lot of events this week. We've got several food events this week during Climate Week. The Food Systems Economic Commission, also known as FSEC, is an independent academic commission set up to equip political and economic decision makers with tools and evidence to shift food and land use systems. And it's really working towards providing some recommendations to food system transformation. And last, we have EAT, which is a science-based platform for food system transformation. They're an international NGO based in, is it Oslo or Stockholm? I always forget. One of the two great countries or cities. So the three of us, we work together a lot on food system transformation issues across different fora. And this is one example of an event where we're coming together. Maybe we'll show a short video right now of the FSEC Commission, and a report's going to be coming out later this year that is really the culmination of a lot of years of work that Katerina here in the audience, who you can speak to later, has been leading with others. So maybe show that video real quick.
Hi, my name is Herman Lotzekampen, and I speak for the Food System Economics Commission, in short, FSEC. We are an independent academic commission to support people who want to transform the food system. We will provide integrated economic evidence and recommendations to support policymakers, companies, and maybe you when deciding which pathway to take.
My name is Stella Nordhagen. Our current way of producing food follows the principle, produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. We raise animals in factories and use large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides on increasingly large fields to raise yields and lower prices. Additionally, most current agricultural policies favor large-scale, capital-intensive farms over smallholder farmers.
This has many negative consequences that we call hidden costs of the food system. River pollution is one of those side effects. Others include deforestation and loss of biodiversity. More than 700 million people don't have enough to eat, and even more cannot afford a healthy diet. Instead, they eat sugary, fatty, and salty food, which can lead to health problems such as diabetes or heart diseases.
But how can we achieve a food system that's healthy and fair for people and for our planet? We at FSEC think that in order to come up with useful advice, we have to look at the food system with all its dependencies and interrelations with the economy, climate, finance, public health, the political system, and more.
Some of us focus on food production and environmental impacts, others on dietary change and health impacts, or on policy instruments to guide the transformation. By bringing together our respective disciplines, we are able to explore possible pathways for food system transformation on a global scale.
However, future pathways based on computer modeling alone are insufficient to tell us what's needed to achieve the required societal changes. We also have to identify the right policy interventions. That's why we're also reviewing agricultural and food subsidies, taxes or regulations that exist in all countries around the globe, their effectiveness, and also why it's so hard to change them.
In short, we, the Food System Economics Commission, take different perspectives into account to come up with feasible recommendations on how to transform the food system so that it's nature positive, healthy, and fair.
Our findings will support policymakers, companies, and people in their decisions on which food system pathway to take, both globally and nationally, into a future that's good for people and for the planet.
Hey, great. A little bit lagged, but that's okay. I think we got the messages. Yes, today we're going to talk about one of the juggernauts in food policy, subsidies. Incredibly contentious, many different views on their impacts, positive and negative, and the implications of how do we reform or change them or reorient them. So we have a really stellar lineup of speakers and a fantastic moderator, Mario Herrero, who are going to try to unpack this very complicated space of agriculture subsidies. But let me first introduce Mario, and one of our speakers is online, Danielle Resnick, so she'll be joining us as well. Mario is a great friend and colleague of mine. He's a professor at Cornell in the Department of Global Development, and he's the director of Food Systems and Global Change. He's also a Cornell Atkins Scholar and the Nancy and Peter Menig Family Investigator in the Life Sciences. Mario does a lot of work across the scale of global food systems. I think he really cut his teeth when he was living in Kenya for more than a decade working on livestock, but he's really broadened and has looked at all kinds of aspects of sustainability across food systems for benefits for humans and ecosystems. He works a lot on climate mitigation, adaptation, livestock systems, cost of food, sustainability metrics. I have the pleasure of working with him on something called the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. And he's just a great guy. And I hope, particularly for the students, if you can stick around and chat with Mario after, you will not be disappointed. So Mario, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. That was a very kind introduction. Well, you know, this is one of the most important things that we could try to do. Repurposing agricultural support. And just imagine if we could actually just achieve a little bit of that, we could go a long way in really transforming the food system. To start us on this journey, we have two phenomenal people to give speeches. We have Richard Damania, the Chief Economist of Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. And we have Dr. David Laborde, now the Director of the Agri-Food Economics Division at FAO. So Richard and David are really going to introduce the topic. Richard will talk about detox development, which is a recent report that they've launched, and the need to fix incentives in the food system. And David will actually present the FSEC's findings on the potential for repurposing subsidies. Richard, can you join me on stage just to start us? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to see all of you. Can we have the PowerPoint? Just wait for it to show up. No, that's not it. Do I have to? Ah, that's it. Okay, excellent. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a is a snapshot and really a fraction of some of the things that we discovered in a recently put out report that we called Detox Development, because there is something especially toxic about the way we do development, and as you heard, by implications about the way we actually do agriculture. And what we discover is that there's missing trillions in the way we do agriculture, the way we do development, because of the way that we actually spend money. And what this report does is it looks at three critical sectors. Sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide deck. We look at three critical sectors. We look at the energy sector, we look at agriculture and the food sector, and we look at the fisheries sector. We're not going to spend too much time worrying about what the sums are, what the magnitude of the subsidies are, other than to say that they're very large. What's called explicit subsidies, that's the money that's handed out by countries to these different parties, be it in energy, be it in agriculture, be it in fisheries, and that comes to roughly about $1.25 trillion. We know that that money is not wisely spent. That money does a lot of social damage and does a lot of environmental damage. I must emphasize that it is only partial accounting because we cannot monetize all the damage that is actually done. And again, you can easily add $6 trillion, and that is a lower bound, a very, very clear lower bound. I've spent my whole lifetime trying to do this, but anyone can tell me how to truly value biodiversity loss, you'll win the Nobel Prize. You can put any monetary value you want on it, but is that the true value of the losses that you're encountering? And we can go on about that in terms of human life and so on. So the losses are very, very large. Because we are here talking about agriculture, I'll give you a snapshot about 40 to 50% of the results that we have, because I have about 6 minutes left to talk to you about this. Okay, so let's begin. Oops. All right. In terms of the distribution of subsidies, one of the things that you clearly find is that the East Asia and Pacific region tends to spend more on subsidies in terms of developing countries than anywhere else. That number is largely driven by China in terms of developing countries, which tends to have much, much bigger subsidies than almost any other country. There's a trend, however, that you will see. The larger is the agricultural sector, the higher are the subsidies, and the larger is the agricultural sector in GDP, as a proportion of GDP, also the larger will be the subsidy. The other thing that you might draw out of this graph is we distinguish between coupled and uncoupled subsidies. So a coupled subsidy is something that is tied to either input or output, and that, as we will see, will distort your decisions, whereas an uncoupled one, oops, sorry, something happened there, thank you. Okay, whereas an uncoupled, sorry, hopefully you can see it now, an uncoupled subsidy, on the other hand, doesn't do that same level of harm. Again, you see a little bit of a trend. A lot of developing countries tends to have coupled subsidies. Most of them, but not all exclusively, tend to be input-driven subsidies that you tend to have. Developed countries, especially in the EU, there's this trend towards having uncoupled subsidies, which, as we will see, is a good thing. All right, that's the magnitude of the subsidy that's paid out. An obvious question to ask ourselves is, in an ideal world, what would you like your agricultural policy to actually look like? Clearly, if I'm going to pay you as a farmer money, one of the first things I want you to do is to be more productive. I would like you to be much more efficient and to produce more. And we try to get at this issue in three ways. And I think perhaps this is the most comprehensive work that's been done on it, but maybe there's more. The first thing that we try to do is that we have a panel data, and we try to explore econometrically and work out what it is that you would actually find out econometrically in terms of efficiencies related to subsidies. But of course, global panel data is never very good, so you home into specific countries where you have good data, and then you use much better econometric techniques, and you try to explore what you get doing that. And then, of course, we did a meta-analysis to try to work out what it is that's discovered by all the other surveys. And what we found strikingly in all three is that you might find that subsidies could increase output, but uniformly they reduce efficiency. Let's think about this. If I give you, say, free fertilizer or free seeds or free water, it might increase your output of food production, but you're going to use that free water recklessly and waste it because it's free. That reduces your efficiency. So it makes intuitive sense. And indeed, this is what Economics 101 would tell us would happen. You can drive it a little bit further now. Ask yourself, what kind of subsidy is more or less distortionary? And we go into this issue. So what we find is that the worst, most distorting kind of subsidy is an input subsidy. So if I subsidize, say, fertilizers, I will use too much fertilizer, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. A little bit less bad is an output subsidy. Suppose I subsidize rice relative to, say, corn or something else. At least I might produce that rice efficiently, even though I will produce more rice because it is subsidized. So it tends to be less distortionary in the sense in which economists look at these distortionary costs. And of course, no surprises whatsoever. The best is to have uncoupled subsidies, that is unrelated to either input or to output. Okay, so that's the efficiency side. Let's now touch a little bit, and this is only a fraction of the results, on the environmental side. If we want a good subsidy, clearly one of the things, if I'm going to pay you as a farmer to do, is to minimally use your land and water kindly, or not do harm to that land and water that I'm giving you. What do we actually do across the world? All right, let's start with something which I think is a very, very big externality that we have globally, nitrogen. I think most of you are sort of science-based or food-based, and I don't have to convince you how important nitrogen fertilizer actually is. I think we know for a fact that if we didn't have nitrogen to use as a fertilizer, there would probably be tens of millions of lives or people around that could not exist. Nitrogen is essential for food productivity. And if you look at that chart, you will see that there's massive nitrogen use in Asia. The leading figures for nitrogen fertilizer, China, India, and the United States. On the other hand, you will observe Africa, which is that slither in blue, much, much less nitrogen that's actually used. However, if you look at trends recently in Africa, the trends are certainly going up. So we might argue, isn't that a wonderful thing? Because indeed nitrogen was one of the things that enabled, say, the Green Revolution in India and in many other places. As usual, there is an if and there is a but, and I'm sure you all know that story. One of the things that we know about nitrogen is, on average, and I'm sure the scientists here have better numbers than we've come up with, but we know that on average, globally, there's a bunch of numbers that tell us 40% of the nitrogen applied to the soil will be absorbed by the crop. What happens to the remaining 60%? Some of it is leached into water. When it's leached into water, we know the problems that it can cause. It can cause blue-green algae. We also know that nitrogen is terrible for human health, which is why there's a limit to the amount of nitrogen concentration in water at 10 parts per million. You exceed that and you start getting things like blue baby syndrome. So nitrogen is harmful for human health. Nitrogen also, some of it, will be vaporized and turn into nitrous oxide. And we know that nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than is CO2, which is why some scientists say it is the largest global externality that we have. And of course, it is the subsidies that are responsible for quite a lot of the impacts that you see. What that graph is actually telling you is that where you have coupled subsidies, you're seeing much more pollution into water. We can do the same thing in terms of the impacts on stunting and human health. Where you have the uncoupled subsidies, which is the green, the decoupled one, you're seeing no impact. And of course, the confidence interval crosses zero. So it's really saying there is no statistical impact, which is exactly what you would expect to see. So clearly, in terms of the nitrogen that's used, the subsidies are doing terrible harm. This is especially relevant now because all of you will have heard stories of prices of nitrogen going up, the government's increasing the subsidies for nitrogen as the prices go up, yet this profligate use continues. This might have been a good opportunity to reform the way we use nitrogen. I'm going to end very quickly now with another big result that I think is really, really important. We know that a lot of agricultural subsidies go towards commodities that are produced on the forest frontier. Things like soy, things like beef, things like timber, things like cocoa beans, etc. And we know, of course, the more I subsidize, the greater is going to be the expansion of that product. And what we find is that 14% of deforestation, this is not a modeling result, this is an econometric result, a causal result, 14% of global deforestation is a consequence of the subsidies that are paid. And then you can go further and work out precisely where those subsidies happen. And what we also work out is that you tend to get cross-border subsidies. We can have an increase in subsidies. Am I out of time? Am I out of time? Murray, am I out of time? Half a minute? Okay. 40 seconds then. What we actually discover is, of course, you can have a subsidy, a beef subsidy paid in the United States, and you can econometrically track the impact of deforestation it might have in Brazil. Now, to go very, very quickly, let me skip the regressive impacts of subsidies in the hope that someone talks about it, because when I pay subsidies, it is on outputs or inputs, and the richer farmers produce more and they get more of that subsidy. Sorry, I'm trying to move this, advance this. Where I want to end in my last 30 seconds is to say, oops. Sorry, let me try to advance to the right slide. Okay, one more. What I want to end up with, how do we reform subsidies? We looked at every single case of subsidy reform, be it a success or be it a failure. And there were some results that came out in terms of successes. And the story that we distilled in terms of the successes was, if you like, these 5 steps that I won't talk you through because I don't have time. But if you want success, I think there are 3 things that are common to success. The first thing is you need to communicate why you're having subsidy reform. Secondly, you need to compensate, because if you don't compensate, you're going to get a backlash. But your compensation needs to be credible, because most farmers will tell you, I can't believe politicians, or what happens when the next government comes in. Is that a credible promise that I have that you are going to retain the subsidy? So we go through what the steps are for the reform, and we kind of try to have a pathway to what a successful reform would be. With that, let me end. Thank you so much.
And now we're going to have David joining us for his presentation.
Yes, thanks everyone for being here. In the few minutes I have, I am going to try to tackle some of the issues that we have already seen discussed in the previous presentation, and actually to think how we can move away from that. I will not start to talk about the political economy that already been touched about, and my colleague Danielle will elaborate on. But actually, in some of the results I'm going to talk about today, the ghost of the political economy is there. And we should not forget about it. So with the FSEC and with IFPRI, we have done a number of work on this. And let me maybe summarize also the work that have predated this new work. What we have learned in the last few years on this question of repurposing, in work we have done with the World Bank, actually with and at FAO, and also during the UN Food System Summit. So first, when we talk about agricultural policies, we have different types of policies that have very different impact. So we cannot simplify, because once again, the impact on different people is going to be different, but also an output subsidies and input subsidies, but also even an input subsidies mean very different things in different places. For instance, an input subsidies can be a subsidy to better seeds. And I think on that, most people will agree. You cannot really overuse better seeds. At the opposite, a subsidy to fertilizer, we can, as it had been shown, basically waste fertilizer if it is free. For some countries, an input subsidies is actually subsidizing extension services, knowledge. If it is paid to a private entity that will train people. For other countries, it's public training, it's general services. So we have this challenge first to understand that the subsidy spectrum is very rich. And also, we talk about support to farmers, and subsidies is not the same thing. For economists, sometimes we put them together because they are similar effects, but for policymakers, it's very different. Actually, today in the world, there is no a billion of subsidies in agriculture. There is not even 600 billion of subsidies. There is 430 million of subsidies. And why this amount is because that's really the amount of policymakers give to farmers food transfer. And that's what they can actually repurpose, okay? When they play with prices, of course, they do transfer from one actor to another, but it doesn't really, they don't control this money. So when you start to tell them, or you go to the European Commission and you tell them, oh, you know, we have 600 billion of subsidies, they say, no, we don't have 600 billions. We have 400 billions, and that's what we can actually negotiate on. So this precision, I think, is very important. And that's something that we will discuss in a number of reports. Then, when you remove these subsidies, you are not going to solve problems, because these subsidies already face the world, that if you remove them like this, you are going to have an income problem in many countries. You are going potentially to cut production in some places, and food prices will go up with other impact on poor people. But even on greenhouse gas emission, for instance, removing subsidies today will not solve the problem. So that is why we want to use it in a better way. Last but not least, just bringing more long-term productivity gain are not going to also solve the problem. We need to get sustainable productivity gain. We need basically green innovation. Because if we just produce more, of course it's going to, productivity gain in itself is good, but based on the challenge we have, we need biased innovation and things like this. And last but not least, most of the subsidies we are talking about here are farm level subsidies, they are supply side. So don't think you are going to fix your nutrition problem, that is first of all a consumer problem or an income problem with a supply side instrument. Because in most of the case today also you have something called international trade. That means that what you produce and what you consume is different. So we need to make sure that we understand the different policy instruments, who control them, which one can be reformed, and which one will be more difficult to reform depending on the goals you have. We also have to acknowledge the inequality in the world when we think about subsidies. So basically half of the subsidies in the world are in high income countries that just produce 1/3 of the food. Then another big slice is in upper middle income countries, or basically the G20. So low income countries basically don't spend in agriculture. If they don't spend in agriculture, they don't have a lot to repurpose. So one of the challenges and what we look in the FSEC world is, can we deal with these imbalances? Can we better use the money we have globally within borders and across borders to get a world that is more efficient, more fair, but also more realistic in terms of pathway? And the first step was really to looking at the hidden cost of these policies with Stephen Lord, that has done a great work in looking at that with very detailed database to see what is the impact of removing policy today. And removing policy today will actually increase the hidden cost of the food system. Why? Because you are going to shift production from relatively highly efficient system in the north or in some upper middle income countries and move it to lower middle income countries and low income countries that doesn't have today the level of productivity. So let's say that you stop producing food in Europe. For each hectare of land you may start to restore in Europe, you are going to lose 2 or 3 hectares of land in the global south. And in addition, all the biodiversity losses that already occurred in the global north, all the deforestation that have occurred in the last 20 or 30 or 50 years, it's not going to be regained when actually moving production south will actually start to do primary destruction. So that's really something we have to think. We cannot oversimplify. Maybe we should have never used bad subsidies, but just making them disappear, not going to solve the problem. Because the world has been shaped by history, I've been shaped by subsidies. Sometimes I've been shaped by these inequalities, but it is our starting point. We cannot just reset the world and we start from zero. Except potentially also in some low-income countries that, as we discussed today, have not spent yet. And that's going to lead me to discussing the new work we have done in particular, is, as it has been discussed by my colleague from the World Bank, actually, the richer you are, the more you spend on your farm system. So the question is for all the low and middle income countries that start to become richer, are they going to start to spend on the agriculture? And are they going to reproduce the mistake of the past? Actually, if you look at the example of China, 30 years ago, they were taxing their agriculture. Then they start to subsidize their agriculture with very coupled subsidies, very destructive one, including for their environment. And starting in 2015, they say, okay, that's not a good idea. Let's start to get better policies. So are we in a world where everyone is going to do the same mistake again and again? Or can we start to tweak development in another direction? And looking at this question, now the reality that in terms of timing, even if the poor economies are going to spend more, we need to transform our food system in basically 10, 15 years. So just the economic growth of the low-income countries, including in Africa, is not going to give the space enough to do all the big changes we need. So yes, we can put them on track to better policies, but they will not have the fuel to really to move on this road. So then we look at what's happened if we start to rebalance this policy. And we say, okay, let's have a more dreamy system where we say every farmer in the world is going to receive the same amount of decoupled payments. And what it means today, it means still we are going to basically reduce incentive to be farmer in the north, increase incentive to be farmer in the south, in particular in low and middle income countries. So we will do this transfer. But if we don't transfer technology, if we don't transfer productivity gain, here also, that will not be good for the environment. Good for nutrition, because we will increase income in the south and diversify production. Good for poverty reduction, but not good for the environment. Really, so this question about how we can produce in a better way, and how when we think about moving this money around, because part of repurposing is moving this money around, how we can make sure it delivers from a very technological point of view, that's going to be key. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. I think that you've just shown us how complex this is and how many perverse incentives. It's like probably pressing a balloon, you know. If you try to do an action on one here, then it will come out. The effects will come somewhere else. I'm going to do a slight change in the program, and we'll continue with Danielle Resnick now. So that and we'll do the questions at the end. So Danielle is a non-resident at the International Food Policy Scientist at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and a David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution in the Global Economy and Development Program. So Danielle, if you could make your remarks, then we'll do all the questions at the end.
Okay, thanks, Mario. And just confirming you can hear me okay on that side? Okay, I'm assuming you can. And I think Ali's going to help advance the slides for me. So just want to thank you for the invitation to be part of this event today. Apologies for participating virtually. As the slide suggests, I'm going to talk about the ghost that David alluded to, the political economy dimensions of repurposing agricultural subsidies. This draws on some work that was commissioned by FSEC and done with my IFPRI colleagues Will Martin and Rob Voss. It also draws on some additional research from a forthcoming book on political economy of food system transformation. Next slide, please. So I think first it's useful to just take a step back to think about why repurposing subsidies is so difficult from a political economy perspective. I won't go through all of these, but just to highlight a few points here. You know, when we used to think about political economy of agricultural policy, we used to focus disproportionately on producer versus consumer interest. And, you know, in the last 15 years, agricultural value chains have become extremely complex. We have many more actors and interests that we talk about. There's banks, insurance companies, transnational civil society, international food corporations. And that all means we have, a number of diverse interests and coalitions in the policy process. We've also seen in the last decade the growth of political polarization, especially in OECD countries, the growth in populism and a liberal democracy that leads to the denigration of evidence-based policymaking. And I think environment and climate policy in particular has been very vulnerable to these forces. And then I think as well, when we're talking about repurposing, it's a little bit different than our normal discussion about just reforming or getting rid of subsidies. It really involves what I call a double gamble on the side of the public, because you're not just having faith that government is going to reuse resources efficiently, but they're going to do so in ways that are going to have positive impacts on the environment and biodiversity, and hopefully with not too many substantial increases in the cost of food. So it really involves having quite a bit of confidence in the political will and capacity of the government. Next slide, please. So for FSEC, we had developed this basic diamond framework that's trying to get at different dimensions that feed into political will and implementation capacity. The top half of the diagram integrates issues such as, the interests, the ideas, the values of different interest groups vis-a-vis repurposing subsidies, how those are filtered through different types of economic and political institutions to determine who has power and leverage in this sphere. How analytics, such as modeling work, such as the econometrics we saw, how does information and misinformation feed into debates and deliberation among interest groups? And then combining that with some of the dimensions at the bottom half of the diamond, which get more at implementation capacity, and really thinking about policy characteristics. Certain policies tend to concentrate the costs and benefits a lot more than others. Some policies are much more visible or have a longer time frame to evidence impact. And so we took this framework, we used it to look at several different cases of what we call successful and stalled reforms, successes in quotes, because I think it's always relative to the time frame that you assess it in. Something that looks good in one period may have had negative externalities a few years later. But we generally looked at cases where, in settings where you have very high subsidizers, and you have countries that have agricultural sectors contributing to high greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at the EU, the US, China, and India in particular. Next slide, please. The following 4 slides are going to just take some of the broad lessons learned vis-a-vis those 4 main dimensions of the diamond diagram I just presented to you. So first, kind of on the ideas and interests and values, we know interest groups are really central to this entire debate about, well, any type of reform, but especially in our discussion here on repurposing subsidies. And thinking about, who is very well organized and able to shape the discourse around the repurposing agenda. So, the case of India in 2021, where Modi was trying to implement 3 farm reforms. One was getting away from the market support procurement system, and that was going to have important impacts on cereal farmers who use an intensive amount of water in production. And we saw, very well organized cereal farmers in combination with state politicians being able to really lobby against this policy. Meanwhile, horticultural producers who would have actually benefited from this reform were less well organized and really couldn't get their voice into the policy sphere. And that broadly points to the importance of coalitions in propelling or stymieing any type of reform. We often see in this space strange bedfellow coalitions where we have different groups that may share similar policy goals, but for very different reasons. And they can come together, as I said, to kind of propel or to stymie reforms. Ideology is really coming to the fore in some of these discussions as well, as I noted about earlier, particularly when we see windows of opportunity for reform and also windows closing. We've seen this with the rise of green parties in Europe and how that assisted with trying to green some of the common agricultural policy provisions, also with pushing towards the drafting of the Green Deal and some of the farm to fork provisions within that. But more recently seeing the kind of rise of conservative and even extra institutional movements, including the BBB farmers movement that upset the Dutch elections last fall. And even this week, a lot of discussion about what's happened to the farm to fork strategy. Is that actually going to move forward? Next slide. Institutions really shape the number of veto players in the policy sphere. And obviously, the more kind of multi-layered institutional structures you have many more actors that you need to please in order to push reform forward. And so you often see in these multi-layered institutional settings that reforms tend to be much more diluted. By contrast, when you have these more kind of concentrated institutional systems, you can push forward sometimes with much more ambitious reforms in a shorter time frame. And David already alluded to some of the pretty remarkable changes in China over the last 15 years or so, going from taxing to subsidizing agriculture, then moving around 2015 to a more kind of pro-green agricultural policies, and their store grains and technology program trying to raise expenditure on ag R&D by about $4.1 billion. So a huge amount for ag R&D. Next slide. On analytics and information, this is where we really need to be kind of thoughtful about how we engage some of our modeling, our econometric and other type of analytical work, how we engage with diverse stakeholders, and better understanding their perceptions of risk and uncertainty with regards to the reform process. This, of course, was a big issue in the Indian reform attempts, that it was pushed out very quickly. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, with a push towards organic fertilizer with hardly any consultation with farmers. And I think this broader understandings of where, trust or distrust emerges vis-a-vis the government, and perceptions of how marginalization from these discussions may distort how information, even evidence-based research is perceived by affected stakeholders. What's interesting is in the last few years, with the rise of farmers' protests across both developed and developing countries, how these protest movements are really shaping how information is filtered into the public sphere. And last slide, please. Finally, on the policy characteristics, when we're thinking about how we're going to proceed with different options, reorienting subsidies to ag R&D is a low visibility reform, and it tends to be, while extremely important, it tends to be less appealing to politicians, particularly in low income and democratic settings. By contrast, as I alluded to earlier, China, with kind of a less pluralistic setting, not really concerned about electoral cycles, you can push forward some of these reforms that don't really have the visibility to the public. But on the other hand, reorienting subsidies to more desirable environmental practices, tying them to conservation practices or biodiversity practices, offer much more visibility, but they also require much more bureaucratic oversight. So they need to be quite, well calibrated to those institutional settings that I talked about earlier. So I think the next slide is the final one. It's just reiterating again, considering the political economy environment, to think through what is going to have the most traction, and considering what investments could really widen the wind set of policy instruments, going from not just calibrating to the enabling environment, but thinking about how we can catalyze reforms by finding credible allies with leverage in the policy sphere. Obviously trying to crafting careful messaging that's sensitive to different stakeholders' concerns and inclusive deliberation. So I'm going to stop there and turn back to Mario. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Danielle. That was really good. And now, finally, to give us a reality check, we have Tianna Kennedy, a farmer. She's the co-owner of Start Root Farm and the 607 CSA, a founding member of the Catskills Agrarian Alliance, a chair of the Catskills chapter of the National Young Farmers Coalition. I'm sure that this will really bring everything to reality and to life. Thanks, Tianna, for being here.
Hi, everybody. Well, we've been talking a lot about subsidies, and that actually hasn't played a big role in my farming career. And that is because subsidies are generally for commodity crops, and and so I think I'm here to talk about, we've been talking about the rich North and the global South, and even within our own country, we have, small holding farms, and we lack support and infrastructure and subsidies for those. We lack crop insurance for diversified crops. We lack transportation subsidies. We lack infrastructure help. So basically, the reason that this is all important is that, especially in the moments of climate uncertainty, where we have droughts, where we have fires, and the production in these, what we've all been assuming are stable systems, are not as stable as we thought, and there are breakdowns in supply chains, and we need to think more regionally. And I agree that we have about 10 to 15 years to make these changes. So even within our own country, we need to think about policy reform and figure out ways to create efficient systems that are not just like go to your local farmers market, that tap into the good work that's been happening since the 50s to feed the people, but to regionalize them, to prioritize replicability and resiliency over scale, perhaps, and efficiency, which is what has been prioritized since the 50s. And so I guess those are that's the talking points in terms of subsidies, but I just wanted to sort of show you the work that we've been doing that has been primarily, volunteer based for 15 years and is now supported by private funders. But it would be really great if we could, work on policy to help us with these sorts of regional food systems that we're trying to create. So I guess we'll just go through the slideshow really quick. I don't know if I have access here. So this is our new nonprofit. Basically, these are some of the issues that we're dealing with. I'm gonna stand over here so I don't have this. But in our farmers are dealing with low wages, systemic racism, housing insecurity, and waning farm viability. Most farmers make about, I don't know, I was making about $300 a week for years and years. So, and whereas our farm laborers do get at least minimum wage, the owners often take that risk. And so we've created this beautiful thing, and it is based in the Catskills, but also New York City. And it comes from, it's not something that we just invented. It comes from 15 years of organizing with local farms. So I started a small little vegetable farm. We started cooperating with neighbors because it's really expensive to get to the city. So we started cooperatively marketing under the CSA. It grew over time during the pandemic when supply chains were breaking down and people were losing their restaurant accounts. All the farmers locally wanted to jump onto our project. All the consumers wanted secure food that they knew that was going to be there. So we blew up to like an 800-person CSA, working with 40 farms and creating basically a little regional supply chain. And while we were doing that, we also started working with, we realized that this is like a holistic issue. We can't solve one problem and ignore the other problems. There's no saving land and without a viable market. There's no training new farmers without access to land, so we just took it all on. And we also thought that in order to be more efficient, in order to like feed people that could maybe not afford farmers market prices, we wanted to see if we could consolidate and get into farm to institution work and other local wholesale work. And so we've managed to do that as well. And now we're feeding 42,000 local kids with by aggregating these small farms into a more efficient system. Thank you. I just also wanted to point out that the deputy director of our organization is sitting here, Francis, who's also an alma mater of this. So these are the programs we have right now: aggregation and distribution of food. The CSA is sort of the backbone of it. It creates the volume that helps us create the transportation logistics that enable us to carry out all the other work, the mutual aid work and the farm to institution work. We also have my little vegetable farm still exists. We have a new farm partner who's the voice of the farm and the leadership of the farm right now. Her name is Amanda Wong. And she, under her leadership during the pandemic, we transitioned from market-based farming to growing for mutual aid. So we've fundraised and work with various groups in the city and upstate to develop a plan with them. And they basically use it as credit and just order from our wholesale list, either from our farm or the other farms we work with, and our partners in that project. They also help us with crop planning and, determine what they would like us to grow and how they'd like to be involved in the system. And then we are also working on a land access project, and this is where Francis is taking the lead, which is during the pandemic and in general, rural areas don't have a lot of resources for their local community land trust to take on agriculture as a project. And so we saw an opportunity to work with two national organizations, the American Farmland Trust and Agrarian Trust, to create a template of these two organizations working together to buy a farm. There's a 4th generation dairy farmer that didn't have children. So we took out that farm, and American Farmland Trust now owns that. And Francis we have been facilitating the creation of a community board, the creation of a community land trust, and local management for this project, in the hopes that we can take it out as its own community land trust, perhaps in partnership with Agrarian Trust. And so that's providing a space for people that have not had an opportunity to farm based on 200 years of sort of racist USDA policies to get a start and in an opportunity. And then we offer the support of our CSA and other market mechanisms for these farmers, so they're not just being thrown to the wolves, basically. And then, and we touched on the community organizing. But we're also working with Rural Health Network. So we are part of a food prescription program. People can redeem their prescriptions for our CSA shares. And we're working with the school backpack program so that we can get the kids food over the weekends. We're working with Otsego Community Trust and Catholic Charities to identify lower income members of our community, creating USDA style boxes and feeding those people as well with recipes. So we're using whatever our resources of all these farms and working with whatever partners we can to feed as many people as we can locally. These are our values. Oops. Sorry, everybody. It's tricky. There we go. I'll just let you guys read those. Oh, I guess for people that can't see, inclusion and empowerment, living wages. Basically, the history of American agriculture and a lot of other agriculture is based on exploitation of labor. And so it's really important to us that our farm workers and farm owners have appropriate living wages. That's one reason that we became a nonprofit, because when you're competing with subsidized agriculture for price points, you're never going to get parity and you're never going to be able to pay your workers. So this is just a band-aid for that solution, but hopefully we can work on policy to solve those problems. It just takes a while, there's a lag. So I think the most important line here is that CAA addresses the history of racial discrimination in New York farm and food systems, directly prioritizing BIPOC land, farm, market, and organizational access, as well as supplying markets in underserved urban rural communities. So another thing we like to talk about is, I'm wrapping up, is the, the urban and rural dichotomy is less prevalent now than it used to be with network technologies, people working remotely. And we are in partnership with our urban, our communities that a lot of the farmers came from. And so it's really important for us to create this food system that is relevant to both the urban and the rural stakeholders, and that, everybody's participating and has the opportunities that both urban and rural life provides. I think that's it, basically. there's a little bit in here about the current USDA priorities, but maybe we can just talk about that during the panel. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Tianna. Great job. Can I ask the presenters to come to the front, please? Oh, a couple of friends there. Look, that's great. This has been super exciting and great presentations. Hey, Danielle, very important before we start, you can see the code again, the Menti code. Please log in your answers while we do the Q&A session, so that, because we'll need your responses for the next session. Look, this has been super interesting. And what I see here is, you know, as you can, hang on. Hello? Okay. It's basically all about the how, you know, we have all this enormous interest and potential in repurposing subsidies. But in reality, how do we actually start with this? You know, what's the kind of roadmap that we need for this to happen? So I'm going to ask Richard a little bit about his talk. You discussed how currently subsidies are not working as they should, and they cause a range of externalities. Is there one agricultural policy, one single thing that should be reformed to start building a better agricultural support system?
So that works. Okay, I think the one that I would highlight is what I try to emphasize a little bit, and that's the fertilizer subsidy. And I go to that for reason of the damage that it actually does. And just to be very clear, it's not uniform across the world. It's very, very localized. But the commercial farms that we heard a little bit about, they really are over the top in terms of the amount of fertilizer that they use and in terms of the amount of damage that it does to the environment and elsewhere. And that might be a good place to start. One would have thought, particularly with the price rises that we have seen for fertilizers, this might have been a good place to try to at least get reform in the way that fertilizer is used. So if there was a place to start, I would say globally, that might be one place to go, at least in the developed world, where you get gross overuse.
I would also agree, just to chime in, because it's not only about the environmental degradation, but the health concerns. You know, it's about volume versus quality. And so if we want more nutritious food, then that would be a great place to start also. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And David, one of the things that struck me about your presentation, and you mentioned it, most of the subsidies are focused on producers. But in reality, we could think that repurposing subsidies could lead to actually other beneficiaries of value chains, and the consumers might actually receive some of those benefits. What are your thoughts on repurposing along the value chain?
Yes, I think that repurposing along the value chain is a good idea, but in particular for consumers, because what we see is the people that cannot access good diets and good nutrition are basically poor people. So I think at one point, we need to move people to support access to healthy food. That can be through cash transfer. In some case, that can be to invest in the distribution of fresh food like vegetables in part of the territory or city that cannot get this access. So there's investment in infrastructure to do. But that's what should be done. Now, I think really the political economy here is something that is very, very serious. And unfortunately, how much we can actually take some of the money that exists today to take it out of what farmers receive or think they receive and to give it to consumers that are going to be in cities and things like this, that's a big issue. So actually, how much more money we need during the transition to step by step, not just, you know, taking from one pocket to give to another, but to increase a bit the level of the sea when we readjust the different streams. That I think the main challenge.
Yeah, and making a link here between what you talked about and what Tianna mentioned. Tianna, where do you think that more support is needed? Is it at the producer level? Is it for markets? Where do you see
I
it?
would agree with my colleague here that it's in the distribution and infrastructure. There's really huge bottlenecks in processing facilities and cold storage and supply chain and for local regional food systems. And I do think that there should be some support of consumer, but I think that that's again a band-aid for larger and inequity that needs to be solved elsewhere. So I don't think that's the final solution.
Absolutely. Yes. And this is a good segue into Danielle's presentation. So Danielle, super interesting. What are the kinds of new coalitions that we need for this to work? For us to be able to push for these, for achieving more successful examples here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can think about many different coalitions, but some kind of interesting ones that have come about are between our environmental groups and actually kind of market fundamentalists. This is a kind of an example of these strange bedfellow coalitions, right? So you can see on the one side, you have civil society groups or their advocacy groups that are seeing the importance of improving conservation and biodiversity on the one side, and then kind of fiscal hawks seeing the advantages of using resources more efficiently. So this was an important coalition in Switzerland a few years ago, where they were able to actually reform their agricultural policy, making it a little bit less livestock intensive. It really involved overcoming some resistance from very powerful livestock farmers in the country, but they were able to kind of engage in this coalition and take advantage of one of those windows of opportunities I talked about, a kind of a change in the parliamentary coalition at the country at that time. So it's coalitions, maybe these strange bedfellow coalitions, but it's also when they can be entrepreneurial and seize these critical junctures in the political landscape as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps to all of you, what are the realistic timeframes? Obviously, we want everything for yesterday, but what are we talking about here in terms of repurposing subsidies and the subsequent policy reform that really needs to occur? What's realistic?
So if it is about moving the money that exists today, I think we are talking about cycle of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, gradually, because that's a cycle of how farm policies are designed in most places. Common agricultural policy, US Farm Bill, that's not something that will shift overnight and we will just get marginal one. So that's what I think, if we want to have more opportunities, actually, if government decide to actually to invest more in food system and in agri-food system, we will see more money coming. So I think it's about this additional money that should be well directed to tackle inequalities, to tackle environmental issue. And in this process, basically, you start also to dilute the political economy, because if you see in the US or in Europe, saying, okay, now we are going to pay you for environmental services. Yes, but it's on top of what you are giving us today. It's not instead of. And if you say instead of, then you are stuck.
David, I'm an optimist. Give me another number, 15, 20 years. I just can't wait. So what can we do? Where do we start? This, obviously, we're not going to deploy this all in one go. So what's the roadmap? Where do we go? What are the initial steps, the things that we should be doing now? Low-hanging fruits. Could you all comment on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, the Farm Bill is coming up, so it's a perfect opportunity now to support policy that is, supporting small holding farms in our country. And I agree with you that things can happen, and I agree with you that there needs to be additional money, not instead of money. And for instance, in 2023, the USDA awarded 300 million funding for projects dedicated to increasing land access for underserved farmers in the Increasing Land Capital and Market Access Program. And that was a one-off opportunity, and it was a wonderful opportunity for marginalized groups to access land. And so for this Farm Bill, there's an Increasing Land Access, Security, and Opportunities Act that would institutionalize that sort of giving. So there are changes that are incremental and are happening, and it would behoove all of us to support those and to get our representatives to support those.
Great. Okay, Danielle, would you like to make a comment on that?
Well, I think Tianna is much better placed than I am on the ground. I do think, though, it really depends on the policy instrument. You know, as David's saying, if you're trying to shift money around, that takes a long time because you have to be removing money, you have to be reallocating it. That all goes through lengthy processes. But if you're thinking about regulatory mandates, that can have impacts sometimes in shorter periods. You know, for good or bad, people turn to the biofuels mandate in, you know, in the early 2000s in the US and how quickly that shifted incentive structures for biofuels production. We know now it's also having, you know, negative impacts on land use as well. But I think there are different instruments can have different timeframes to impact. But that deliberative process of engaging with stakeholders, I don't think we can rush through that, because if you get that wrong, you can derail the entire reform process and you start back at square one.
Absolutely. David, any thoughts here? Yeah.
Richard.
Oh, sorry, Richard.
Sorry.
Classic.
I thought you were going back to David. Look, I agree with the last point that was actually made is you do need to communicate what you're actually doing. In an ideal world, if you had more money, reform would be extraordinarily easy. But we are living in a world where there's very little money that's actually available, especially poor countries with very high debt. So I think we have to be creative in the way we try to get this reform, which makes it much more difficult. The first thing to do, I think, is to have people more aware of why it is that you want to repurpose the subsidy. What is the harm that's actually happening? If we go back to the nitrogen example, the correlations that you see with cancer, it's correlation, it's not causality. With blue baby syndrome, it is causality, and so on. I think that that information, telling people why it is you actually need it, makes life easier for the politicians to have the reform. Secondly, we're talking not of eliminating, we're talking about repurposing. So it can be done, in theory at least, in a distributionally neutral manner. You just want less harm done. And even that is a win. If you get less harm done for the same money, at least that is something positive that you get. So small steps before you talk about redistribution and moving the money away. At least you can use that same money in ways that are less harmful and that don't change the distribution that you have at the moment. Tough, it's not ideal, not what we would want, but it's probably achievable and realistic.
Okay, now I would love to open the floor for questions. Okay, here I have first you, if you could just say your name and an institution, please, before asking your question. Okay, here, then Glenn, and here. Okay. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ankit. I'm at SIPA, a second year MBA student. Richard, I really loved your presentation. I wish we had more time. But I was curious to know your recommendations on incentivizing countries to reduce water-intensive crop subsidies, rice, sugar, even corn, especially given the context of climate change and water scarcity. Thank you.
Okay, look, that's really, really important. And I wish I had actually covered this topic about the implicit and explicit subsidies to water. And it's a very, very sensitive topic. But just to be absolutely realistic about it, you go through the world, you will see some of the most water-thirsty crops grown in some of the driest places on Earth. You know, continent after continent that you actually go to. There's something really bizarre about growing water-thirsty crops where it's really dry and where nature never intended them to. And again, you know, what one could say is that rather than subsidizing, say, rice, where it's really, really dry, let's subsidize something else, say, just hypothetically wheat, which is less demanding of everything, all of the soil and the water that you would actually require, as an example. So I think that would be a relatively low-hanging fruit, and especially in terms of rice and sugarcane, both the fiscal damage as well as the environmental damage, as well as the health consequences, it really makes no sense when you add it all up, at least to me, in some of the places that you see these crops grown. Not saying eliminate them right across the world, saying grow them in the right places.
Okay, please, yourself. Oh, yeah, okay, go, you go. Okay.
Sorry, thank you for such great presentations. Sajeev Mohan Kumar from Fair Initiative. We are an investor network. I'm just curious to understand, so some of these subsidies create sort of barriers for private investors who want to engage in sustainable practices. Do you know how private investors and the private sector can engage in repurposing subsidies and removing some of these barriers?
Very good question. Any of you who would like to take it?
Well, private investors and philanthropists can prop up the kind of entrepreneurial and transition projects as a proof of concept, so that as they succeed, then we can make cases for government support. So that's sort of what's happening right now in our world, is we're being propped up privately, but we would really like it to be a line item in the governor's budget.
Okay, and David?
Yes, I think when we talk about the private sector, first, there's always this weird thing that we put farmers on one side, private sector on the other, when actually the bulk of the people that are private sector employees, if you want, are farmers working on their own farm. So now, actually, we have also, and that's linked to the question on the value chain, we have to think that competition among farmers is pretty intense. Competition among fertilizer producers or distributors is much less important. So actually, a lot of the subsidies we give to farmers go to other people where we see much more concentration. So of course, if you are an investor, let's say, in a sugar industry, you are pretty happy that the government is subsidizing your sugar producers that actually will not really benefit from it, but you just get sugar at a very low price locally when you have a local monopoly because you have the sugar refinery. So, you know, we have really an heterogeneity of people that operate at different levels, both spatially and economically. And I mean, cheap money coming from the government, always good when you are in. But the problem is not everyone is in, and it's how you deal with coalition for change.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that comment. I have Glenn. Well, you first, sorry, and then Glenn.
Very quick question. Thank you for a great set of presentations. What is the tension between yield improvement and fertilizer use? So from a biodiversity perspective, we want to keep land footprint limited, but feed more people. How do you think about the trade-off?
Yes, please. Go.
Look, I didn't, because I had such a short time, I didn't put up a slide that we have, which is a killer slide, which shows you really nitrogen use and yields across the world. And it's, I don't know what your background is, but if you're an econometrician, it's a non-parametric estimate. Summarize it, basically, this is what it shows. There's a large class of countries and grid cells in the world where additional fertilizer use reduces the marginal productivity. In other words, reduces yields. Most of those grid cells are in South Asia or East Asia that we actually find. So there's intensive uses that you have over there. And that's a horrible situation to actually be in, right? Given the extent of subsidy that's over there and the fact that you clearly see this downward sloping portion. On the upward sloping portion where you could use more fertilizer, there's a whole bunch of countries in Africa and parts of Central Asia where you're actually seeing it. So this is not uniform, and we do it at the 10 by 10 grid cell, 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cell. So it's pretty detailed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Glenn Denning at the back, then Cherry here, and the gentleman next.
Glenn Denning, SEPA, Columbia. Yeah, on that last point about fertilizers, I think I'm trying to put forward a little bit of a different view on the role of input subsidies, and particularly as it relates to fertilizer, and sort of bring everybody back to the reality of the high level of dependency we are in the world on the use of fertilizers. The estimates are 50% of global production is a product of fertilizer, and anybody who sort of contests that needs to take a look at what happened in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago when they banned the import of fertilizer. So there's a high level of dependency on fertilizer. And the fact that we've basically survived the wheat disruptions from the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a testament to the success we've had over the last several decades in improving wheat production in the world, basically tripling production and tripling yield over the last 60 years or so. Similar story with rice, how we're surviving the current disruptions of the rice market. Fertilizer has a huge role in that. So I think, and subsidies of, as you rightly pointed out, Richard, have been very much a part of that, especially in Asia. Why? Because it's not just about cost and it's not just about efficiency. It's about food security and it's about political stability. So this comes into, Danielle, the political economy of all this. It's the importance of that governments are placing on this in various parts of the world, and including in sub-Saharan Africa. And a classic case, of course, that's often talked about is Malawi, and the way since 2005 the country has subsidized fertilizers, inefficiently, absolutely, wasted money here and there, absolutely. But take a look at it. For the last 17 years, only 3 out of those 17 years, Malawi wasn't able to produce its aggregate supply, right? Before that, they were going around with a begging bowl. So I'd add one more thing in addition to food security and political stability, and that is the empowerment that it gives to communities and farmers by being able to access inputs that they would not be able to access if they were just purely depending on the market. So what's more empowering? Subsidized fertilizer or going out with a begging bowl and asking the World Food Programme to come and save you?
Very insightful, Glenn. Would anybody like to comment on that? Well, yeah, everybody wants to comment on that one. So Richard and David.
So firstly, I think if I didn't make it clear, I think I said it, let me repeat it. You do need fertilizer, and if you didn't have the fertilizer and the nitrogen, I think in my talk, I said there'd be probably tens of millions of lives that wouldn't be around today. In other words, it's enabled the food. So I don't think anyone denies that artificial fertilizer as we have it has enabled agriculture as we know it today. And it's been a huge success story in terms of the tremendous increase in food that we've seen across the decades due to fertilizer. That does not detract from the fact that in certain places, very many places, there is excessive use of fertilizer. You can observe that in the quality of the water. You can observe that in the incidence of blue baby syndrome. For those of you that don't know what blue baby syndrome is, that is when the concentration of nitrogen gets too high. The infant's blood flow is impeded, they turn blue, which is why it's called blue baby syndrome, which is why you see correlations with cancers in very rich places where there's excessive nitrogen. So we are not saying don't use the nitrogen, we're saying use it appropriately. And what the thought is that when nitrogen is virtually free, that you literally throw it around, there is an incentive to overuse it, if not to abuse it. So is there not a better way to actually use nitrogen in as close to optimal quantities as we can get? I think that is the point. The point was never to say, don't use it, because we know exactly what would happen.
Okay, and David,
Yes.
a short reply, please.
Yes. So I think what has been said is important. We have to differentiate the fact that we like or not fertilizer and the fact that we like or not fertilizer subsidy. In the same thing when we talk about agriculture and agricultural subsidies. Now, the reality is that these large-scale fertilizer subsidies cause problems even within countries, because actually not even all farmers have access to them. Then we see misuse of fertilizer in quantity, but also in quality. There is an inadequacy between sometimes what the government subsidizes and the type of soil and the type of crops that you have. So you can actually help your farmer with extension services, with soil map, and let them empower them, give them money. If they want to invest in seed, we invest in seed. If they want to invest in fertilizers, we invest in fertilizer. I think that we should not neglect the fact that the political economy of every year having basically your farmers dependent of you giving them a bag of fertilizer is something that locks them in a problematic situation. And so, yes, fertilizer are needed, but we want the right fertilizer at the right place. And we want to make sure that farmers can make their own decision and not just be dependent on what the government decide to subsidize or not this year. And I will conclude also by the inequality we face in this world. Last year, when we have this shortage of fertilizer on world market, why Ethiopia was not able to buy fertilizer is because at that time, India put major purchase on world market and say, we are ready to pay the price you want. And then they give it free for their farmers. So actually you have farmers in India that get fertilizer for free. The price of urea in India has not been adjusted for 30 years. So a bag of urea is much cheaper than a bag of salt. And because this government has the money to do it, then farmers in Africa cannot compete. So, we have to accept this reality and just think leveling the playing field.
Absolutely. Yes. I know that we're running a little bit late, but the last session is coffee and mingling, which is okay. So I'm going to steal a little bit of that time because this is super interesting. So Cherry, please. Oh, look, now all the hands. Thanks, Glenn, because everybody's now starting to heat up, actually.
Do you want to ask a few or?
Well,
He was waiting next.
yeah, you can. Fine. Yeah, the gentleman in
Thank
the
you.
white.
Hi, Jeff Poten, also from Columbia SEPA. My comment is only related to the United States where my experience lies. But if we want to retune subsidies toward more regenerative systems, toward supporting small, mid-sized agriculture, we need to understand the dynamic that exists between large agrobiz companies, agricultural assistance providers, both public sector, land grant extension programs, and private sector soil consultants, for example, and farmers, and then the influence of farmers have on local politicians, which creates a circle. We need to understand that dynamic and work through that dynamic because that's where the power relationships lie. And unless all those stakeholders see value in the transition of shifting subsidies, we're not going to get any progress. And there has been success in this area. I've worked with Smithfield and Purdue, some of the largest agrobiz companies in the United States. And when they see that their interests align with this new agenda, they do propose policy initiatives that will shift. So I think we have to work with that dynamic if we want to see success.
Thank you very much. You see, it's all those SEPA guys. Danielle, would you like to make a comment on that? Or anybody else?
Yeah, I can comment on this point in the previous one. I think that raised a lot of interest. So on Glenn's point first, I mean, I certainly this impetus of food self-sufficiency, that kind of norm has certainly, as we know, driven a lot of countries to defend the use of subsidies. Particularly in Asia, we know it was the foundation of the EU CAP as well. For political stability in Africa, which is a region I know best, it's mostly been kind of urban concerns about political stability, and there's mostly been over food subsidies rather than fertilizer subsidies, and often on subsidies on foods that are imported, like rice that's imported from Southeast Asia. So I think some of the dynamics in terms of the political stability in that region are not necessarily tied to the fertilizer subsidies per se. On this last point, I mean, I think this really highlights two things for me. I think one is about the importance of not creating we see this kind of superheroes and villains when we talk about the food system space sometimes. And I think the importance of seeing, actors' interests change over time. So how, Smithfield, for instance, can see different incentives for reform aligning with pro-reform options. It also points to, the opportunity to be tracking money in terms of campaign contributions from different types of food companies, other types of actors in the private sector and politicians, and kind of, seeing how we can trace the money to actually see where some of these lobbying dimensions come from, and see if those create a kind of an opportunity to start pushing forward on different types of reforms.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Cherry, and then we are going to close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mario. I'm Cherry Atelana. I work with in the Philippines and in ASEAN countries. So I think I have two insights because my company works with 30,000 smallholder farmers, and reality hits on the ground when these farmers we're trying to transition them into sustainable agriculture and regenerative one. One point is most of the government subsidies, very blanket solutions. It's not consulted from the farmers level. It's just like, okay, we got a deal with this fertilizer company or big, farm inputs company, and then we'll distribute it to the farmers, right? But what we're trying to build a case right now, it's because most of our, it's to really have a security of the market that could create a crowd that would demand the government to deliver what's good for the farmers. So instead of a blanket solution, top to bottom, we're trying to create a case on how do we make it bottom up, top up approach. So since I'm in the private sector, we work a lot with our clients that are demanding 1.5-degree meal to feed their employees. So every day, my company, we help feed 60,000 people daily, 5 times a day. And most of these companies, since they want to transition to 1.5-degree meal, it demands for the farmers to really practice sustainable agriculture, good agricultural practices from the conventional one. So we went back to the government and says, like, how do you now develop a farmer-centric subsidy instead of a blanket subsidy? So, and how do you build a case for that and a budget for that the farmers are now asking for organic fertilizer? We don't want synthetic fertilizer anymore. So that's one. And then another one is it really needs to boil down to soil health, I think, because most of the soil is really depleted. No matter how much we bombard with fertilizer, it's not responding anymore. The aquifer is so polluted. So it needs to have like a soil health support. So another case that we're building is how do we support different areas where farmer groups are present with soil laboratory tests, so that the soil laboratory test can support the government for their decision. Because every time we go to the government says, no, this is like the national soil health. It's like, no, it's different. Like in the case of the Philippines, we have 7,107 islands. Indonesia is 13,000 plus islands. So different locality and different crops. So those are the cases that we're building on the ground so that we could help the government repurpose, this subsidy that has been used during political election, but at the same time, build a case that we have a sure market, demand sustainability, and second one, we need to support farmers to have a case that they have soil test health so that they can go to the government, and this is what our soil and our farm needs.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you? If you could make a succinct question and then just a couple of quick remarks here.
Okay. Yes, my name is Neil Curtis, and I'm from a organization, nonprofit called Farm Up Jamaica. And what we do is we help farmers to transition into climate smart agriculture. And so I'm wondering if there are, big farmer, or and I want to say big farmer, right? But farmer organizations, banks that are willing to incentivize that transition, right? Because I hear about a ton of subsidies and things like that for conventional, but what are the moves that are being made to transition our whole world, our globe, into this new climate smart agriculture, not just regenerative or organic, but also taking into account the environment and what that impacts are going to be of the food that we're creating.
Great. So Tiara, well, you take that one, please.
Yeah, really quick. Vilsack, the new head of the USDA, is interested in that. But I don't like the way in which they're framing it, which is to create another like climate smart commodity, like a USDA organic label that would basically, drive up the price of climate smart food and be accessible to a very small percentage of the people. So I think that I'm advocating for exactly what you're advocating for, but I don't like the way in which they're currently thinking about it because I don't think it is populist.
Great, thank you. And on Cherry's question, very, very briefly, one of you.
I mean, I totally agree. And I think that a bottom-up farmer-based approach is amazing, and soil health is the most important thing. So I just thank you for your comments.
Okay, fantastic. Look, this has been a really lively session. Now let's show the Menti meter I just want to see if there's been changes in the picture that Jess showed us first, and how the conversation has shaped the Mentimeter. And I would like a couple of comments from the panelists, just to see what they see here. You can stand up if you want, grab a mic, and we just have a look at it.
Politics.
So you've definitely shaped the word.
Yes, I will react quickly. I think that I will not talk about bureaucracy, even if we have to think that these policies also have to be implemented. So, you know, we can always design the best policy on earth. At the end, you need to rely on institution and government to do it. And we have to be realistic. So sometimes simple and simpler policy are good. No, I really want to focus on gaining trust of farmers, because I think also sometimes we have entered the debate in a very wrong way, starting to say, look, governments are giving money to farmers to kill the planet. So while actually we need the farmers to do this different transition, and we need to make sure that they don't feel that they will lose from this transition. That I think is important. And when we talk about farmers, also we should not make a confusion between farmers and landlords. Because also sometimes when we think about better policy, like decouple policies, and we say, okay, we are going to pay per hectare of land, actually the money ends up in the pocket of the landlords after 10 years, not the farmers. So really this will be an actor of change and help designing these more well-tailored policies.
Okay, all right. Look, I think the shift that we've seen over here is a really good one, because what you're emphasizing over here in this word cloud is really the political economy, the distributional factors, and that determines whether success is going to happen or not. The awareness, distribution factors, getting the bureaucracies on side. So honing in on any of these things, I think, is the pathway to success. We know exactly where we want to go, but we know that the hurdles are really political hurdles. I think we have the knowledge, but we don't know how to overcome the political economy constraints.
I agree, and I appreciate David's comments about trusting farmers, because it's that in my mind, yeah, we really need farmers. We can't demonize conventional farmers or organic farmers, and we just need food. So I like the secure livelihoods moment. And I also agree that we do need to deal with bureaucracy, but I think the devil's in the details as well. It's really important how these mechanisms get distributed with USDA. The grants are tomes that you have to, fill out with experts in June when nobody has time. Most of the money goes to nonprofits, not to farms and or agribusinesses. So I think that, restructuring the ways in which the subsidies are distributed, as well as what the subsidies are, is also really important.
Great, thank you. And Danielle, would you like to make a comment with what you see?
Well, I mean, of course, it kind of resonates with my own interest on political economy. A lot of the words we're seeing up there. I think the accountability is really key. I mean, how do we keep politicians, private sector, even, civil society and farmers themselves, accountable for how repurposing pans out, I think is really key. I think it points, to the broader points that many of the co-panelists have also highlighted, that it's not just about investing in potentially new technologies, but also investing in relationships and investing in institutions. So it really needs to be a kind of 360-degree approach to this problem.
Great, thank you very much. So with this, we conclude the panel. Now, I would like each of the speakers to give us a final words of wisdom. So just, what's the take-home message here, Richard?
I think the take-home message is, if you understand the political economy constraints of reform, you'll actually get it through. And no one ever wants to lose money, no matter how rich or poor they are. So if we keep that in mind, and if you look at the successful cases of reform, they've tended to bear that in mind. Occasionally, you can tilt that balance, but most of the time, you can't.
I mean, when you want to do this type of reform, I said we need farmers, but at the end, there is someone to be convinced, the Minister of Finance. So the value for money, because that's the one that controls the money. So, you know, we need farmers and talk with the Minister of Finance.
Continue to educate yourself, get involved in local and regional politics, and help us lobby for these changes.
And Danielle, what's the
Well, like Richard, you know, obviously emphasizing the political economy, I think, you know, reading the incentive structures, are they driven by kind of normative issues around food self-sufficiency? Is it a partisan, an electoral issue? Is it, as David said, a kind of a ministerial cooperation priorities, ministerial jealousies? So kind of reading the incentive structure, I think gives us some leverage on this binding political economy constraint.
Thanks a lot, Danielle. Look, this has been a super exciting event. And I'm sure that we can actually continue with refreshments. But before we close, this wouldn't have been possible without the help of Ali, Alison, Ian, and Katharina. Thank you very much for the organization. And let's have a chat and a drink. Cheers.